History often paints its kings in gold and glory, but the truth is far darker than the stories children hear in classrooms. There was once a king who was feared more than he was respected, whose very presence filled the air with dread, and whose name has echoed across centuries as a symbol of power, paranoia, and grotesque decay. He is remembered by most as the king with 6 wives, the ruler who broke away from the Catholic Church to form the Church of England. But those are only fragments of the story, fragments that hide a far more horrifying picture. Behind the crown and the jeweled robes, behind the polished portraits that hang in grand museums, the real man was crumbling from the inside out. He was not just a ruler, he was a walking disaster, a body falling apart long before death claimed him. Imagine a man so large that he could no longer move on his own, so heavy that mechanical devices had to be built simply to lift him. Picture a king whose legs were covered in open wounds, bleeding and festering day after day until the stench of rotting flesh filled entire rooms. Servants gagged when they came near him. Some even drew straws to decide who would have the misfortune of dressing him, because standing too close to him was punishment in itself. This was not the powerful, handsome young monarch remembered from the beginning of his reign. This was not the dashing figure who once impressed foreign courts with his charm and athletic ability. This was a monster created by his own appetites and paranoia, a man who turned his palace into a prison of fear, a man who betrayed everyone around him, including his wives, his children, and even his most loyal servants. The hook of his life is not just that he ruled with iron fists and fickle moods, but that his own body became his greatest enemy. By the end, his waistline measured 54 inches, wider than many men were tall. His weight was close to 400 pounds in an age when the average man barely weighed 140. His body carried ulcers so large and foul-smelling that visitors to court described the scent before they even entered the room. It was said the king could be smelled from several chambers away, a human reminder that absolute power could not protect anyone from decay. But the horror does not end there. Doctors now believe he may have suffered a brain injury in his prime, a terrible accident during a joust that left him unconscious for hours. After that, his personality changed. The charming young man became cruel, paranoid, and rage-filled. He turned against those who loved him, seeing betrayal in every corner even when none existed. This is how he became the man who sent wives to the chopping block, who accused innocent men of crimes they never committed, who destroyed friendships and families on the whisper of suspicion. This king ruled as if no law applied to him. He created laws only to break them. He claimed divine right but lived in filth and fear. His eating habits grew legendary. Feasts so large they could have fed entire villages. Food rituals so strange they bordered on madness. Every dish was tested for poison, and the tasters were forced to wait while he watched, certain they would collapse before he dared take a bite. He demanded hundreds of dishes a day, convinced that food gave him power, convinced that swan meat would grant him grace, that oysters would give him strength with his wives, and that deer would make him a better hunter. His meals were theater, hours spent devouring mountains of food while courtiers watched silently, pretending this grotesque display was normal. Even sleep gave him no peace. He surrounded his bed with weapons, crossbows, daggers, and soldiers who stood guard as he tried to rest. He built secret passageways into his palaces, not for escape in case of fire or rebellion, but because he lived in constant terror of assassins. He spied on his own nobles, his servants, even his daughters. He created a world where trust was impossible, where whispers could mean death, where paranoia was law. And when death finally came for him, it was not quiet. His body swelled with gases until his own coffin burst open, spraying the remains of a king onto the road as dogs licked at the leaking fluids. Even in death, he could not escape chaos. His legacy, the one children are taught, is one of wives and churches. But the legacy he left behind was far more monstrous. A warning that absolute power and unchecked appetite can turn a man into something less than human. This is the real story, the one that has been softened and polished by time. It is not the story of a glorious monarch, but of a man who became a prisoner of his own flesh and mind, a ruler who poisoned his kingdom with fear, and a human being who, despite all his crowns and castles, could not conquer the rot within. This is the story of England's most infamous king. The true danger of this king was not only his collapsing body or his endless appetite. The real danger was what his power meant for everyone trapped in his world. A single word from his mouth could end a life. A single mood swing could destroy a family, a noble house, or even the future of the entire kingdom. The stakes were higher than any crown could bear, because Henry VIII ruled not with reason, but with fear and obsession. For his wives, the stakes were life or death, and often death came with cruelty beyond imagination. Marriage to Henry was not love, it was a trap. One day a queen could be showered with jewels and promises, and the next day she could be accused of betrayal, dragged before a court, and led to the executioner's block. Imagine being a young woman, standing in a palace filled with whispers, never knowing if tomorrow would bring gifts or a death sentence. Divorce was not an option. Escape meant execution, and even obedience could not save them, because his paranoia created crimes where none existed. For the nobles and servants who lived under him, the stakes were no less terrifying. To serve the king meant to risk being destroyed by him. A courtier could be celebrated one week and executed the next, all because someone whispered a rumor or because Henry dreamed of betrayal in his sleep. Entire families were ruined because one man or woman fell out of his favor. A joke told in the wrong ear, a look that seemed too bold, even silence at the wrong moment could be twisted into treason. The Tower of London filled with men and women whose only crime was standing too close to a king, consumed by suspicion. But the greatest stakes of all were carried by the nation itself. England became a kingdom shaped by the mood of one man. The laws changed not through careful thought, but through his fury or desire. He broke away from the church not as a matter of faith, but as a matter of lust and pride, reshaping centuries of belief because he wanted what he wanted. He dragged his people into new wars, demanded their loyalty in matters of religion, and punished those who resisted with fire and sword. His paranoia turned not just the palace but the entire realm into a place of fear, and as his body failed him, the stakes grew even higher. A king who could barely walk still carried the power to destroy lives with a single order. His sickness did not soften him. It made him more cruel, more suspicious, more dangerous. The man who could not climb a staircase without pain still forced others to bend the knee, still demanded obedience, still ruled with terror. His rotting body and crumbling mind did not lessen his reach, they sharpened it. Even death did not lower the stakes. When his body exploded in its coffin, when dogs licked at the remains of a king, it was not just a grotesque moment in history. It was a warning carved into time itself. Absolute power in the hands of a man who cannot control himself is not only a danger to his court or his family. It is a danger to everyone under his rule. Henry VIII showed the world what happens when a kingdom is held hostage by the appetites of a single man. This was the terror his people lived with. This was the shadow he cast over England. And these are the stakes that make his story more than just history. It is a lesson about power, fear, and what happens when a king becomes a monster. By the end of his life, Henry VIII was no longer a man in the eyes of those who served him. He was a spectacle of suffering, a ruler whose body had become a curse not only for himself but for everyone forced to stand in his presence. To see him was to see decay walking on two swollen legs. His body grew so large that it defied imagination. A waist of 54 inches wrapped in silk and fur, a frame carrying nearly 400 pounds, and yet it was not the size alone that shocked people. It was the state of that body. His legs were covered in wounds that never closed. These were not scratches or bruises. They were deep ulcers that split open and poured out pus day after day. The smell was unbearable. Accounts from courtiers tell of servants holding perfumed cloths to their faces, desperate not to breathe in the stench of their king. Some fainted, others vomited, and yet they had no choice but to kneel before him, bow their heads, and call him Your Majesty. The horror did not end with smell or sight. Those who tended to him were forced to change his bandages to clean his wounds, to stand close while he groaned with pain. To them it was punishment. They drew straws to decide who would go near him as if it were a death sentence. The ulcers oozed with infection, and in a time before proper medicine, the risk of catching disease was very real. Serving the king meant serving death itself. Some historians now suggest that his grotesque state was worsened by medical conditions beyond his control. They speak of Cushing's syndrome, a disease that could explain his swollen body, his shifting moods, and his skin that tore open so easily. Others point to the jousting accident in 1536, when a horse trampled him and left him unconscious for 2 long hours. After that, he was never the same. What might have been brain damage could explain the violent temper, The sudden cruelty, the constant suspicion. Whatever the cause, the result was the same. The young athlete who once rode horses and won tournaments became a broken man, chained to his own monstrous flesh, and yet, even as his body betrayed him, he refused to let go of pride. He wrapped himself in robes heavy with jewels. He sat upon a throne designed to hide his weakness. He ordered paintings that showed him as strong and commanding, even while he could barely stand. To his people, he wanted to be remembered as a lion, but those who stood closest to him knew the truth. He was more corpse than king. Every step he took was agony. Moving him from one chamber to another required specially built chairs, pulleys, and teams of men. His once powerful legs had become swollen pillars of pain, the ulcers spreading wider and deeper until even walking left trails of blood and pus on the palace floors. Some said the king left pieces of himself wherever he went, his body crumbling as surely as the walls of his kingdom. It is no wonder that those around him feared not only his temper, but his touch. His very presence reminded them of mortality. Here was a man who ruled as if he were a god, yet whose flesh rotted like the lowest beggar. Here was a king who declared divine right, but who could not escape the smell of his own decay. He was a reminder that even crowns cannot cover disease, and that power does not protect a man from death creeping beneath his skin. Henry VIII, the ruler of England, had become a living corpse. And yet he still had years left to torment his wives, his nobles, and his people. For Henry's wives, marriage was never safety. It was never comfort, never the promise of love. To be chosen by the king was to step into a cage where the walls shifted with his moods, where affection could turn to rage overnight, and where every breath carried the threat of death. Catherine of Aragon, the first wife, learned this truth in slow, painful years. She had given him loyalty. She had stood beside him when he was young and strong. But when she failed to give him the son he wanted, she became useless in his eyes. He locked her away, separated her from her daughter Mary, and spread rumors that she was mad. Her last letters to him went unanswered. She died alone, a queen without a crown, a woman stripped of dignity by the man who once called her beloved. Anne Boleyn's story was sharper, quicker, and crueler. At first, Henry showered her with gifts and promises. He broke with the Pope for her, rewrote the faith of a nation to place her beside him. But when his passion burned out, suspicion replaced desire. He accused her of adultery, of witchcraft, of treason. The worst cruelty was not the sentence of death, but the theater he created before it. Her own brother, her friends, her musician, innocent men were tortured and executed for imaginary sins with her. She was made to watch as their blood spilled, knowing her turn was next. Her head fell beneath the axe, but not before her spirit was broken by betrayal more painful than steel. Jane Seymour was praised as the gentle one, the quiet one. She gave him the son he wanted, the boy who would inherit the throne. But her reward was death from childbirth fever, and the king who claimed to love her was courting his next bride before her grave was cold. 9 days after her funeral, he was already planning the next marriage. For Henry, even grief was shallow. Anne of Cleves was the lucky one, if luck can be found in terror. When Henry decided he did not want her, he could have ordered her death. Instead, he forced her to agree that their marriage had never existed. She signed away her crown, bowed her head, and thanked him for the mercy of sparing her life. It was not freedom, but it was survival. Catherine Howard, barely more than a child, suffered one of the most tragic fates. She was a teenager when he married her, too young to understand the monster she faced. When whispers of her past lovers reached him, Henry responded with fury. He made it treason for any woman to marry the king without confessing her sexual history. The law itself became his weapon. Catherine was dragged to the block, trembling, terrified, her short life ending beneath the blade because she had once loved before him. Finally, Catherine Parr outlived him, not by escaping his wrath, but by outlasting his failing body. She cared for him as his health rotted, standing beside him when others could not bear the sight. But even she lived in fear. At one point, Henry nearly had her arrested for treason over her religious ideas. Only his sudden change of mood saved her. She survived, but not without scars left on her spirit. Each wife lived in Henry's shadow, and each carried the same weight, that their fate depended not on law, nor on truth, but on the shifting storms inside the king's mind. They were queens of England, yet powerless. Their lives were jewels on his table, easily admired, easily discarded, easily shattered. For them, the stakes were not only their own survival, but the safety of their families. When Henry turned against a wife, he did not stop at her. Brothers, sisters, friends, all could fall beneath his paranoia. To be chosen by the king was to be placed in a silent prison where love was a mask, and betrayal could be imagined at any moment. This was the horror of Henry's marriages. 6 women, 6 lives twisted and broken by a man who saw them not as wives, but as pieces of a story only he could write. If Henry's body was a disaster, his table was its engine. His appetite was not just hunger, it was obsession, ritual, and a display of power. What he ate, how he ate, and how much he demanded became another weapon of control, another way to remind his court that he was no ordinary man. Meals for Henry were not private. They were performances, staged in grand halls where nobles and servants alike watched in silence as the king consumed food fit for an army. Each day his kitchens prepared more than 800 dishes, not for the kingdom, but for the royal household alone. Over 200 cooks, bakers, and servants worked without pause, slaughtering animals, boiling soups, roasting entire pigs, and baking endless loaves of bread. Their work was not for survival. It was for one man's desire. He could devour thousands of calories in a single sitting. An entire roasted boar, several chickens, heaps of fish, towers of sweet pastries, and rivers of wine. What he left behind could have fed villages, yet it was thrown aside, wasted, forgotten. His hunger was never simple. It was decorated with meaning. He believed that swan would make him graceful, venison would sharpen his hunting skill, and oysters would give him strength with his wives. He filled his body with these foods as though he could absorb their power. But instead of strength, they brought more decay. The strangest part was not the food itself, but the fear surrounding it. Poison haunted Henry's thoughts. Every dish was tasted by servants first, not once, but several times. They ate under his watchful eyes, then waited as the king studied them, searching for signs of collapse. Only after half an hour of silence would Henry take a bite. Eating was no longer a simple act. It was a military operation, guarded and controlled, as if each meal was a battle to survive. Even the smallest details were bound by his paranoia. The salt on his table was tested by one servant, the wine by another, the spices by yet another. Every hand that touched his food was watched by soldiers. He trusted no one, not even the cooks who had served him for years. The kitchen itself was a locked fortress, guarded as carefully as the throne room. His meals stretched for hours. Courtiers stood at attention while he stuffed his body with meat and sugar, pretending this was normal, pretending it was honor to watch a king destroy himself. They whispered about him in private, but in the hall they smiled and praised him, even as the stench of his wounds drifted across the room. The irony was cruel. The very diet he believed gave him strength was the same diet that killed him. The mountains of meat, the endless wine, the sugar and fat. It all worsened his ulcers, his swelling, his pain. Yet he refused to stop. He believed his crown made him untouchable, that the rules of nature did not apply to kings. He ate as if his throne was armor, as if he could bury weakness beneath another feast. And so, day after day, the table became his battlefield. His servants gagged on the smell of rot. His nobles stood silent as he wiped grease from his sores, and his body swelled until it became its own prison. Food was not nourishment for Henry. It was power. It was fear. It was the slow and grotesque march toward his ruin. By his final years, Henry VIII was no longer simply feared for his temper or his power. He was feared for his madness. His paranoia spread through the palace like a disease, infecting every room, every servant, every whisper of conversation. To live near the king was to live under constant suspicion, where a glance or a word could be twisted into treason. He slept surrounded by weapons, daggers beneath his pillow, loaded crossbows near his bed. Soldiers stood inside his chamber, watching him breathe while hidden passages wound through his palaces in case he needed to escape assassins who never came. He spied on his own courtiers through peepholes, planted informants in every hall, and even ordered his children watched. Princess Mary and Princess Elizabeth, his own blood, were treated as if they plotted rebellion before they were old enough to hold power. In such a world, trust did not exist. Servants betrayed masters, Nobles betrayed friends, all hoping to survive one more day under the eye of a king who trusted no one. People were executed not for crimes but for possibilities. A dream, a rumor, a careless word could mean the Tower of London, could mean the block and the axe. The court was a theater of fear, and Henry was both its playwright and its audience. But his body, already ruined, continued to fail him. He could no longer walk without pulleys and chairs, his legs dripping infection, his skin splitting and leaking flesh onto the floors. Servants trailed behind with cloths to wipe up what he left behind. He was king, yet he was also decay made flesh. When death came, it did not arrive with peace. His body swelled grotesquely, stretched tight as gases built within. The smell of rot filled his chamber until even hardened doctors turned away gagging. No one dared come close. They waited for the last breath, but few wished to be the one to confirm it. A king who had ruled as though immortal was reduced to a mass of swollen skin, a husk that frightened even those paid to tend him. Then came the funeral. His body was wrapped in lead, sealed in layers of wood, and carried from London to Windsor. The plan was to hide the rot, to preserve dignity in death. But dignity never belonged to Henry in life, and it did not follow him into the grave. On the road, his coffin burst. The pressure inside was too great. Gas tore the wood apart and pieces of the king leaked into the hearse. The smell stopped the procession. Servants with rags and buckets tried to contain the mess, but it was too late. The king had broken free of his own coffin. Dogs prowled the roadside, licking at the remains that spilled from the cracks. The man who once demanded loyalty through fear had become food for strays. Even the earth resisted him. His grave had to be dug wide, the soil collapsing beneath the weight of his body and its lead casing. Years later, people claimed strange noises rose from the tomb, foul odors escaping long after burial. Whether it was ghost or gas, none could say. But the legend remained. Even in death, Henry brought horror. This was the end of England's most infamous king, not a noble passing, not a resting monarch, but a warning. His legacy was not just the church he built or the wives he destroyed. His legacy was fear, corruption, and the reminder that power cannot shield a man from his own decay. Henry VIII ruled a kingdom, but he could not rule himself. And so his story ends not with triumph, but with the sound of a coffin bursting open, a final act of chaos from the king who would not rest. History remembers Henry VIII with paintings and portraits, polished faces framed in gold, a massive man dressed in silk and fur, a king staring with hard eyes that suggest power. But portraits are lies. They hide the smell, the wounds, the paranoia. They cannot show the fear he placed in the hearts of his wives, his servants, his children, and his people. For centuries, schoolbooks softened his image. They told of 6 wives as if it were a story of romance or drama, reducing lives destroyed into a rhyme for children to memorize. They spoke of the Church of England as if it were a bold act of leadership, not the desperate move of a man who wanted another wife. They described him as strong and commanding, yet never told how he could barely move without a chair or a team of servants. They told of his crown but not his ulcers, his throne but not the pus dripping from his legs. The truth is that Henry VIII was a king who ate himself into ruin, who drank until his body swelled, who turned his fear into law, and who left behind scars on everyone who lived in his shadow. He built an empire not on wisdom but on terror. Every man and woman who walked his halls lived in silence, weighing every word, every glance, because their survival depended on the moods of a man who trusted no one. Even in religion, his legacy was stained. He declared himself head of the church, not from faith but from desire. He tore his nation away from Rome, set fire to monasteries, and claimed holy authority for his own lusts. Priests and bishops bent the knee not to God but to Henry's will. Faith became another weapon in his hand, reshaped to match his hunger. And what of his heirs? The son he wanted so desperately died young. His daughters grew up in the shadow of his cruelty, forced to watch their mothers fall one by one. They lived through years of suspicion, knowing their father's love could vanish without warning. The line he fought to secure was fragile, weakened by the chaos he created. The kingdom he claimed to protect was fractured by fear, divided by religion and left uncertain of its future. This is the true legacy of Henry IV, not strength, but weakness disguised as power. Not greatness, but terror painted as majesty. He ruled for decades, yet his greatest achievement was showing how fragile a king can be when ruled by his own appetites. His body collapsed under the weight of his feasts. His mind cracked under the weight of his paranoia. His wives broke under the weight of his suspicion, and his kingdom bent under the weight of his fear. The coffin that burst open was more than a grotesque moment. It was a symbol. The man who built walls, who locked doors, who demanded control over every life and every word, could not contain himself. His corruption spilled into the open. His body, swollen and rotten, refused to remain hidden. The dogs that licked at his remains were not just scavengers. They were history itself, stripping away the lie of glory, leaving only the truth. Henry VIII wanted to be remembered as a king above all others, as a lion among men. Instead, he is remembered as something less than human, a caution, a warning, a story whispered with disgust. His life shows what happens when power is unchecked, when fear replaces love, and when a king becomes a prisoner of his own decay. His throne has long turned to dust. His crown rests in glass, but his story still lingers, a reminder that behind every jewel, every robe, every crown, there may be only rot.